Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Today we are joined by Luke Fletcher, Plaid Cymru member of the Senedd for South Wales West. Elected at the age of just 25, Luke has become Plaid Cymru's economy spokesperson. Thank you very much for joining us today, Luke. How are you?
Good, thanks. Struggling with heat, to be honest. I never do well in this sort of heat. But other than that, yeah, pretty good.
Good. So, whilst we will get on to Welsh politics proper, I promise, probably can't talk about anything political at the moment without discussing the goings-on at Westminster last week. And the question I wanted to ask you is, are you annoyed that the independence movement has lost their best recruiting sergeant in Boris Johnson?
Yeah, well, I mean, if we were going to be basing the whole independence movement on, building up support just on based on one person, then we were going to be doomed from the start, really. I mean, look, it's about time that this happened. I mean, let's make no mistake, really. All the cabinet members have started sort of jumping ship. They weren't doing so on principle because they've been back in demand for a couple of months. I think it was more to save their own skin than anything else. But I'm happy to see him go because I think the issue more than anything else with having someone like Boris Johnson in the top job is it sort of poisoned really the sort of political discourse, day-to-day political discourse, I think, which was no good for any political party, no good for anybody in politics in terms of the quality of debate. So I'm hoping now that with Boris being gone, we might be able to start to have a bit more sort of quality debate on things. I mean, looking at the current leadership contenders for the Tory party doesn't fill me with much hope. But who knows? We'll see where things go.
On that topic, it's, Labour politicians all the time get asked which candidate they would and wouldn't want to win, for the purposes of a general election. Have you had any thought on that yourself, and which of these prospective Tory candidates would be best and worst for Plaid Cymru or independents potentially as a future campaign?
I'm going to be totally honest, I wouldn't want any of them to win, and I wouldn't want a Tory government in Westminster. I think the reality is no matter who comes into power is never really going to have Wales at the forefront of their mind when they're making decisions. And I would say the same as well for any Labour leader. Yeah, reality is I wouldn't want any of them to win, to be honest.
Going into one of the things that Boris Johnson did deliver, whether you think it was good or not, but it was Brexit. But what do you think Brexit has done to the Welsh economy?
Well, I think when we say that because you've seen a lot of Tory MPs now go on and say, oh, well, with all sort of due credit, he delivered on Brexit. I mean, I wouldn't say he's really delivered on Brexit at all. We're still seeing massive issues right now with trade. I mean, I think it was the Financial Times that said that something like 100 billion a year had been lost in trade and tax as a result of Brexit not being part of the single market and customs union. I think that additionally was about 40 billion in revenue for the Treasury. I think in terms of where we're at now, I think a lot of the sort of economic predictions that we made prior to the referendum have seemingly come true. It's one of the reasons why, I'm sure we'll come on to this later, but it's one of the reasons why, as a party, Plaid Cymru, we've been talking about rejoining the single market and customs union. Granted, that's not necessarily going to be an easy task, not going to happen overnight, but I think the way things are at the moment, I think we have to build that case and we have to have that discussion. One of the reasons why we brought it to debate in the Senedd, one of the reasons why we've been discussing it as well outside the Senedd.
What do you say then to people who say that you couldn't have Wales rejoin the single market or the customs union without damaging the internal single market of the UK? And whether that would be more or less damaging to the economy of Wales than leaving the EU has been?
Well, I think the internal market of the UK is already being damaged by the fact that you have one element of the UK sort of in the single market, but not at the same time. I mean, we're talking about Northern Ireland, yeah, and there's a whole host of reasons why it's a bit more complicated on that side. I don't think I need to go through those now, but the reality is, I mean, the single market or the internal UK market, is already damaged. I think we have to look at what essentially we want to achieve, what sort of economy we want. I mean, we're seeing a lot of barriers be put up now for businesses with increased costs when looking to export. Now, one of the ways in which we can solve that issue is rejoining the single market and customs union. That, I think, again, it's not going to be the easiest thing to do, but we do have to build that case and we do have to at least have that conversation about where we want our trading relations with one of the biggest trading blocs in the world to go. And obviously, in terms of Wales, prior to leaving the European Union, I think off the top of my head, I think it was something like 58.9% of trade in Wales or exports in Wales went to the EU. That's a massive chunk. I don't think I need to emphasize that point. But again, it's about the conversation now, I think, of where we are going in the future in terms of our relations with one of our closest neighbours and one of the biggest trading blocs in the world.
What was the Welsh Government response to this proposal from Plaid Cymru? Do you think they're sympathetic to it, or do you think they are sort of more following the UK Labour line on the idea of the single market and the customs union?
I think the First Minister's response to Adam Price when he brought it up in First Minister's questions was disappointing, because it seemed to me that there was sort of a willingness to follow UK Labour, not wanting to be seen to contradict what's being said by Starmer. But at the same time, I do think that there is a number of Welsh Labour members, both in government and in the backbenches, are still open to that idea. We know Alan Davies is one of them. We know there's a couple of others as well. I think it is. I will be totally honest here, I think it's a bit of a difficult position for Welsh Labour, but I think the important thing, the overriding factor should be what's best for Wales in this instance, rather than following a UK party's line. It should be about making sure that we make the best case for Wales. And again, our position is on that is rejoining that single market and customs union. And hopefully, as that debate develops, we'll see Welsh Labour and the Welsh Government become far more open to that idea as we progress.
Obviously, Plaid Cymru are in favour of rejoining the single market and the customs union, but would you think it would be accurate to describe Plaid Cymru as a party that is in favour of rejoining the EU?
Well, I think we haven't shied away from the fact that in the long term we would like an independent Wales to rejoin the European Union, but that is a matter, of course, for a post-independent Wales. As we become independent, that's part of the conversations we're having at that point. We've made it clear that we would want Wales to rejoin the EU under those circumstances, for sure.
I suppose the question there is, areas like, although you represent Settlers West, the areas you're from in like Ogmore, etc., were quite heavily Leave voting areas. Do you think that it's a difficult reconciliation for a party like Plaid Cymru who are trying to advance in sort of Leave areas? Do you think it's hard to sort of win those people over by saying that, or do you think that the circumstances now are materially changing in a way that people can see that Brexit is not all it was, set out to be?
Well, I think the question has to be, and I think this is a question that we as a party grapple with quite often, is are we purely here to see Plaid Cymru succeed electorally, or are we here to see Wales succeed? Now, I fall on the latter. I want to see Wales succeed. It's a difficult sell, of course. My home area, obviously, I live in Pencoed, which is in Bridgend County. That was a heavily Leave area. I think, though, when we look at the sort of figures that are coming out from the government itself on how trade and revenue has been damaged by not being part of the single market and customs union, and as we face a cost of living crisis as well. Again, I'm sure we'll come on to this later on. We're facing a situation where 4 in 10 households in the UK are struggling, or in Wales are struggling to afford the basics. I think we have to look at every option that's available to us. One of the biggest sort of I'm trying to think of the English one now. Bwysfilod, one of the biggest sort of, let's just say monsters then, just because that's sort of a direct translation, but it's probably not the word I'm looking for, to be fair. But one of the biggest sort of, elephant in the room, there we go, is the fact that we've had a massive upheaval through Brexit. Now, there is obviously a bit of a problem, isn't there, when we discuss the single market and customs union. It gets conflated a bit there, whether we are arguing to rejoin the European Union right now. I think it's important that we focus on the aspect of joining the single market and customs union, and it's something that other countries are already doing. We've got Liechtenstein, Norway, to name but two, in the single market and customs union, but not members of the European Union. So I think, as we sort of take all of those into considerations, that cost of living crisis being the predominant one for me at least, we have to look at every option on the table, and it's going to be difficult to convince people who voted for Brexit and voted to leave. But I think it's a matter of sticking with principles and doing what's the right thing is in our view. And that's what I think the job of politicians is as well, is to identify that problem, is to identify that solution and then build a case for that solution. Now, if we're successful or not is another thing, but we at least, I think, still have to have that conversation and debate.
So let's move into a little bit of the cost of living crisis. I mean, we've seen in recent months significant increase in industrial action. Plaid Cymru have been seen, in support of striking RMT workers, etc. And to be fair, so have some Labour MSs too. But the UK Labour position on trade union rights has shocked many. Was that a particular surprise to yourself and to Plaid Cymru? Do you think that there is an area there for Plaid Cymru to work really closely with trade unions in the future if UK Labour continue to have this fairly disappointing position on it?
Speaking for myself, it was surprising in a massive hit, really, actually. I mean, when we talk about a party that was founded by the trade unions, a party that is supposedly there to represent working class people, people like my family, for example, the fact that they wouldn't support people who were striking for better pay, especially during the cost of living crisis, completely baffled me. And I think, Plaid Cymru, as always, or where we've tried our best, at least, to work closely with trade unions, and we've made a lot of good relationships within the trade union movement. The RMT strikes are just obviously one of the potential strikes that are going to happen over the summer. We know, of course, that BA workers are potentially looking to potentially strike. Again, it was surprising to see the Labour Party not support them, which again, that baffled me. It's something I wouldn't have thought would have happened. But then again, looking at the direction in which the Labour Party is going at the UK level, especially, it seems to be a bit of Tory light, if I'm going to be totally honest. But again, we know the CW were balloted workers. So I think as the summer progresses now, I don't personally think that Labour's position, again, when I say Labour, I mean UK Labour on this point, because again, like, as you said, in all fairness to some Labour MSs, they were also supportive of the RMT strikes. But I don't think as we go into the summer where we are seeing more workers struggling, for example, to afford the basics, struggling with this cost of living crisis, and as a result of that, asking for better pay and being refused, and then using the only option that they have, which is to strike to level the playing field. I don't think UK Labour's position is going to be sustainable. One of the things that really, really disappointed me around the RMT strikes was the demonisation of workers, essentially, for striking. Now, striking is not fun. I mean, you lose a day's pay, and if you're striking particularly on the point that you aren't being paid enough, then it's going to hit even harder. It's the only tool I think that workers have to really level that playing field. It's not something that's done lightly. So that was something that was really disheartening for me, seeing that demonisation of workers asking for better pay. But the language that they used around that, and I know I'm going on a bit, but the language that was used around those particular strikes has been used for centuries to divide workers. Because the reality is, the bosses, the bankers, the big corporations who are consistently refusing better pay to their workers know that if we all realise that we had a joint sort of cause here, that their days would be numbered. And so the language has always been there to divide workers. But, having said that, the language that was being used didn't seem to quell support for the strikers. I think it was very clear. I think there was a poll in Wales that showed a majority of people in Wales were supportive of the RMT strikes. That's a good sign, I think, especially as we begin to grapple with that cost of living crisis now. So hopefully that sort of direct action, which I think has been lacking over the past couple of years in British politics, hopefully now we're going to see a bit of a change here, and we're going to start seeing some more action to level the playing field.
Interesting what you're saying in the last couple of answers, especially considering the UK Labour position on things. Do you know when Mark Drakeford always says things would be better if we had a UK Labour government? Obviously, you're going to say that Wales should be independent, but whilst we still are part of the UK, do you believe him? Do you think that there would be a material difference in how Wales is run if there was a UK Labour government compared to having a Conservative one?
Well, just to say it, yes, I do think Wales You get look, I mean, I don't share Drakeford's optimism, if I'm going to be totally honest. I mean, okay, let's say that Labour came in and things did get better. And then when Labour coming in at the UK level, that would be great for the time the Labour's in power, but then you'll only see the Tories get back in as the wheel turns, as a word in UK politics, and then all that progress is smashed. We saw that when the Tories came back into power in 2010, albeit in coalition, but still the majority party in that coalition. But I think as well, you know, there's no guarantee that the current iteration of UK Labour will come in and be be a positive for Wales. There seems to be a reluctance at the moment of not wanting to devolve further powers to the Welsh Parliament by Starmer's party. So I don't share that optimism the First Minister has. For me, the only way that we can secure, you know, a socialist government in Wales, for me, has always been through the route of independence, because Wales consistently votes for left-wing governments. I wish they were voting for Plaid Cymru governments, but you know, I'm sure we'll come back to that at some point. But the reality is, there's always a left-wing government in Wales, or at least a left-wing party in power. We've never voted for the Tories. So for me, to stop the Tories from coming into power, the only way we can do that is by becoming independent, because I can't see England, or at least can't see England anytime soon, becoming more left-wing. I mean, if anything, England seems to be lurching further and further to the right at quite a worrying pace, to be quite frank.
Let's move on to the cooperation agreement then, Luke. Do you think you would describe it as being successful so far?
Well, you know, it's just, in some ways, it's still early days, isn't it? But I mean, one of the biggest successes for me has been the free school meals, universal free school meals to all primary school children. That's starting in September from the bottom years and then working their way through. I think the goal is to have it rolled out completely by April. Again, that's off the top of my head. But I mean, that in itself is a policy that is going to change so many people's lives, and actually, you know, quite a important policy. We've said the cost of living crisis. You know, I said that sort of succession of words so many times. I feel like a bit of a broken record. But you know, that policy in the midst of a cost of living crisis is going to help so many. That, I think, has been one of the biggest successes of the cooperation agreement so far. We have other things coming down the line. Again, I'm sure we're going to come on to this at some point, Senedd reform. We have things elsewhere as well. But for me, so far it's been successful. I hope the implementation of universal free school meals will be done at a pace. I'd be happy to, or incredibly grateful to see a lot of the local authorities rolling it out completely before that April date. It's a policy that's quite important to me. I've talked about it quite a few times in the chamber now, but you know, I was on free school meals when I was growing up. I know the benefits of them. So for me to see that happening as a result of Plaid Cymru and Welsh Government coming together and working on those shared objectives is a great source of pride, and something that it does, in all honesty, get me quite emotional as well.
One thing you've really been campaigning quite hard on, Luke, is EMA, you know, education maintenance allowance, where you say, you know, it's been set at £30 for basically forever. Do you want to talk a little bit about your work on campaigning and that, and sort of how successful, how likely it is, do you think, that change will be brought in? The
payment has been at £30 since 2004. That's when educational maintenance allowance was introduced. So we're talking about a payment that, you know, don't get me wrong, is incredibly amazing, and I'm incredibly grateful for the fact that it's remained in Wales. Again, I was a recipient of that in school, but the reality is now that the payment has started to lag behind in how much it's actually worth. The Bevan Foundation did some work that calculated that the payment would have to be at £45 rather than £30 for it to be of the same value that it was back in 2004. I've been asking questions of the minister, particularly the finance minister, taking the angle of, you know, where we see additional money coming from Westminster, will she prioritise increasing the payments of education maintenance allowance? Again, incredibly important as we come into the cost of living crisis, because that money is directly given to students, and there's no better way of supporting people than by directly giving them the money. I know the Welsh Government are sympathetic to the cause, but you have the sort of classic answer of there not being enough money to do it. It's something I'm going to continuously campaign on, and I have no doubt that Welsh Government ministers are sympathetic to the cause. So hopefully where we might see more money come as a result of banner consequentials in the future, where the Welsh Government's budget might increase. Hopefully that would be one of the policy areas that would be increased, because I know it would help so many people, help so many post-16 students to stay in school, because the reality is one of the biggest reasons you see a drop-off, especially of those kids who are living in poverty, is because they want to get out and get a job and start earning, because of course they can't afford to stay in school. So that's one of the, I think, the most important things we can do actually to keep them into school. And again, we had a debate in the Senedd on Wednesday, which was introduced by John Griffiths, who was the Labour MS for Newport East. And the debate was titled Knowledge is Power, Education is a Route Out of Poverty. 100%. You know, I know John was a beneficiary of that. I've been a beneficiary of that. You know, Mike Hedges also contributed in that debate, a beneficiary of that again. So all three of us in that debate could speak to it. The problem, though, I think that we're going to be facing very quickly, if not that we're already facing, is that people cannot afford to stay in school in the first instance. So that was one of the points that I made on that the cost of the school day will restrict people from actually going or traversing that route out of poverty, because either they can't afford it or they can't afford, to get to school in the first instance. We talked about free school meals, for example, and that being a massive leveler when it comes to students. Well, it's all well and good having that policy, but if kids can't afford to get to school to have those free school meals, then it sort of defeats the purpose of it. So I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Again, I think Welsh Government are very sympathetic to it. So I think it's only a matter of time. At least I hope.
Obviously, we know that the cooperation agreement is a negotiated process. We waited with bated breath for forever, waiting for it to come. Sometimes we thought it might not happen at all. But is there anywhere you wish it had been more radical, where you wish that the Welsh Government would have accepted going even further?
Sticking with the free school meals policy, again, one of the biggest successes so far of the cooperation agreement. Plaid Cymru have been consistent on asking it not just to be rolled out to primary school students, but to secondary school students as well, because poverty doesn't end in primary school. I can tell you that now. But again, I think the important thing with the cooperation agreement was that we found those areas that we can work on for the benefit of people, which is why we're all in politics or at least that's why I hope most of us all of us are in politics for, is to help the people that we're elected by. And whilst I would have liked it to have been rolled out to secondary school students as well, I will definitely take all primary school students as a starting point. There's not just me in the Plaid group, but Sianed Williams as well, Helen Vychan, and a few others who have been pushing Welsh Government to go further on that point. So there is disappointments in that sense, but I think again as well when we look at creating agreements between parties, you do have to compromise on some stuff. But again, I'll take free school meals for all primary school children without a shadow of a doubt, and use that as a stepping stone to secondary school.
I think there's an understanding that it is a confirmed agreement, but do you think that there's argument for it being a sort of almost living document? Because if you look at the economic conditions of now compared to when it was agreed, the economy is significantly worse now. Inflation is significantly higher than it was at that point. Do you think there could ever be an argument for sort of revisiting certain aspects of the agreement, or do you think that that is something that maybe the designated members will have to do in their sort of quasi-governmental roles with the Welsh Government?
Well, I think one of the good things about the cooperation agreement is, we've agreed to work in some of these policy areas, but there's still room for us to be in opposition outside of those areas. Like, if we're going to have any sort of agreement, I think it has to be sort of organic in the sense that, things get chopped and changed within those policy areas to reflect the time. I don't think it would be a wise move to not be open to those sort of things. But I think one of the good things about that cooperation agreement is, like I said, we have our designated members who work with the government in those policy areas, but there's still freedom for those of us who aren't designated members to still question Welsh Government on policy areas that are important to us and still provide that opposition.
One of the biggest changes that we're going to see as a consequence of the cooperation agreement is Senedd reform. What was the response, not only of sort of elected members, but of party members to the proposals? Because I know within Labour, there was some discontent that people didn't feel like it was perhaps proportional enough, didn't feel that they'd been consulted enough on that. Was it a similar feeling in Plaid Cymru, or were people just happy that we were getting more members finally?
I think it was a mixed bag in the sense that, as a party, we've always advocated for STV as being our preferred choice for electoral reform. We haven't got it as a result of this Senedd reform. So naturally, there are members who are disappointed by that. But I think what we've managed to achieve is a massive step, bringing the Labour Party with us to agree to increase the Senedd to the size that we've agreed to is a huge step. And so whilst it's not everything that we wanted, I think that's the nature of negotiating and compromising. You don't always get what you want. We certainly haven't got what all of us have always wanted, but it's a big prize, I think, because we have, all of us, realised and accepted that the Senedd has been underpowered in terms of the number of members for quite some time. We have more powers being devolved to the Senedd, but yet haven't got the capacity to scrutinise those areas, but also to look at getting more powers involved and developing more bills. If you think about members of the Senedd now, I mean, if you look at the Plaid group, all of us are portfolio holders, so all of us essentially on the front bench. We're all on 2 or 3 committees. So there's no room for members, in all fairness, to develop those expertise in those areas in the same way that, say, an MP would. So the reality is, I think, whilst we might have not have achieved what we have wanted in this instance, which is to get that STV, we have increased the number of members in the Senedd as a starting point, which will allow for better scrutiny. And that I think, I can't remember who said this now. You probably will remember, to be fair. But good scrutiny pays for itself. That's the point I think that's important here, and that's what we've managed to achieve as a result of this, hopefully.
Do you think there would be pause to re-examine certain bits of the reform in the next term? Do you think that there is actually a legitimate chance that we could eventually see STV? Or do you think that when politicians are elected under a certain system, they're sometimes reticent to change it?
Well, I think I'm a regular listener of Hiraeth, as you know, Matt. And the last pod, I believe it was the last pod anyway, we had Heaven David on, and he made this point, and I agree with this point, which is, you can never get constitutional reform perfect. It's always changing. He used the example of the United States. There's amendments happening to the Constitution all the time. Who knows? As we go into the future now, there is likely to be further debate on the constitutional settlement for Wales. SCV could be part of that. There could be another voting system that's part of that. We don't know, but I think that's the nature of constitutional change, is ever evolving, ever changing. So who knows?
Do you think that it's likely that because of Plaid Cymru's inherent fondness for STV, Plaid Cymru run local authorities will look to implement STV, or do you think that will vary dependent on the particulars of each leadership?
I think it's a good question. I would hope that applied local authorities would be looking at STV. I know that there are a number of local members who support the idea. I think ultimately it varies down to leadership, and I think as well capacity within councils to look at, to seriously look at changing the electoral system. We know that council resources are overstretched as is, but hopefully we'll see now, as a result of Senedd reform, the council starting to look at their own electoral arrangements, and then we'll take it from there.
Electoral reform does make it probably more likely as well that Plaid Cymru will play some part in the policy landscape of future Welsh governments, doesn't it? Do you think that not only will this empower Wales in terms of enabling better scrutiny, etc., but do you think that eventually this could see a more radical, progressive Wales as well?
That's certainly my hope. I think there's a lot to be said about Plaid Cymru's influence on Welsh politics, and I would argue it's been quite substantial. We've moved Welsh Labour further and further to being sort of pro-Wales. I mean, I know that sounds a bit silly, but we have had a massive impact, I think, on Welsh Labour policy. We've brought them as part of this cooperation agreement, in my opinion, brought the Welsh Government further to the left than they were previously. Again, I use the example of free school meals, something that Plaid had put on the floor of the Senedd, I think about a total of 4 times, and 4 times it was voted down by Labour. Well, we won that argument now. My hope is that more members would result in greater scrutiny, and as well result in more radical, more progressive policies. I think especially to tackle poverty, which is completely rampant in Wales. So that would definitely be my hope.
I mean, I think I know the answer from you on this, but there are some in the Labour Party who say that electoral reform would open up the door for Plaid Cymru Conservative coalitions. I'm assuming that your answer to that would be never, yeah?
Yeah, well, you know me too well on that point. Yeah, look, I mean, I wouldn't be a member of Plaid if I thought that was a reality. I don't have much more to say on that, to be honest.
Fair enough. So, I mean, there's a really interesting thing you said about in the discussion we've been having about scrutiny, which is there are some who have recently claimed that the cooperation agreement has made Plaid Cymru less able to hold the Welsh Government to account. Obviously, there's been changes to the amount of questions that party spokespeople are allowed to ask, the nature of topics that you're allowed to bring up during plenary questions. You know, the fact that Adam isn't allowed to ask any questions relating to the cooperation agreement. What has been the practical influence on the cooperation agreement on your ability to ask questions of the government and to hold them account?
Personally, I haven't seen much of a difference from my perspective. The biggest priority for me as somebody who's elected to the Senedd is that I represent the people that have elected me. I certainly have been asking all sorts of questions. Sometimes that's resulted in me venturing perhaps into the cooperation agreement. But you know, it's part of I think again one of the positives of the cooperation agreement. It allows us to have an influence on government policy. It allows us to work with government on those areas that are very important to us. But it also allows us to be in opposition. I certainly haven't seen, or at least don't agree with what the Conservatives have been saying on this point, because we know that Andrew Atty has made this point several times in the press. I certainly don't agree with it. I haven't seen a difference on my end. And I know that, again, other members of the Plaid group haven't seen that difference as well and continue to scrutinise government.
Luke, thanks very much for coming on to talk to us. We've got one more question before you go, which is, obviously, we've got the last week of the Senedd term heading now, where everyone's looking forward to a very well-deserved rest. But what are you going to be campaigning on when we get back in September in the Senedd?
There's a number of things really, but if I had to pick one, it's going to be around EMA. That's been my biggest campaign so far. It's something that I think is genuinely going to help a lot of people. It's something that is quite close to my heart as well. So if I was to pick one of them out of the many, EMA for sure.
Luke, thank you very much for coming on today to talk to us. If people want to hear more from you, where can they go and find you on Twitter? Twitter
is @FletcherPlaid.
Wonderful. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Luke. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find us on Twitter and Facebook @HereI'vePod, or go to our website, www.walespolitics.com. Thank you for listening to Here I've. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.